I've been looking at corporal punishment statistics, and it doesn't look like all slaves were subjected to whipping or to death threats. It seems that some slaves were living as kind of a kind of co-evolving life form with their slave owners. They had their own homes produced by the slave owners. They had a place to live, and they were satisfied with it. And so I'm not sure that I can generalize on the slave experience like you guys are doing. I think that there are some slaves who are experiencing this as an improvement of their condition compared to where they were in Africa.
No, that's not true. Most of the slaves that had these homes and everything else that you're talking about, these were slaves that were generations in and so far removed from Africa, they couldn't even tell you what tribe they probably was from. Like they was broken down mentally and colonized the second they got here. They were stripped of their culture, stripped of their language, stripped of everything. So they didn't have anything to compare it to. They was born on the plantation. So what was they comparing it to? So I'm a little confused how you coming up with this narrative.
Well, what I'm saying is that if you look at how they had access to literacy, how their own babies could survive, you mentioned it, they were reproducing. I mean, there are people in Africa who couldn't reproduce, who would be stuck as slave, who would be sterilized. And I'm saying their mode of life was not necessarily experienced as violent by all of them. I'd love to have testimony of slaves. I don't think we have many, but I'd love to know about it. But the fact is they could eat, they could have literacy at higher rates than Africa, and they could reproduce. All of these things are things that are not accessible to every Black person back in the days on this earth. In fact, just the idea of being cared for and being in an environment where they can have some form of health care was an advantage that they had. The simple fact that their babies could survive and could live on this plantation is experience. I don't know about the experience. I'd love to know. Do you have testimonies of slaves and how they felt about living on these plantations? As far as I know, you cannot work if you don't know. If you are living under a terrible state of violence, at some point there would be a punishment for slave owners who are too violent against their slaves. And ultimately what you want is slaves that are happy to work and that are in condition physically to do the work. And so the amounts of violence that we measure, I think that All-Type reports them as maximally 0.5 whippings per slave per year. And it seems that there were some plantations where violence was regular and some plantations where it was absolutely absent.
Yeah. The whole literacy thing on the plantation is actually a joke for you to say that. It was illegal for slaves to even read. The only people that was allowed to read were certain particular slaves on the plantation that they chose to read the Bible. That's the only book they was allowed to read. They was allowed to read the Bible. They taught them how to read so they could read the Bible and preach the scriptures to the slaves. And they would take and they wouldn't. This wouldn't even be every plantation. This would be one particular plantation in the area, and they would take this one slave who actually knows how to read and preach the Bible to everybody, and he will go from plantation to plantation to plantation in that local area, preaching to the other slaves and everything else. And one of these slaves would be Nat Turner. He was one of these people that they actually chose to do this. And he was one of the only slaves on his plantation that knew how to read. Actually, he was the only slave, that knew how to read on his plantation. They would travel him around from plantation to plantation. That's how he actually got all the connections he got before he actually had his famous slave revolt, was because he knew he knew all the slaves from traveling around from plantation to plantation, and he was able to rally them up in order to have the famous slave revolt out in Virginia. So let's not act like all slaves had this high education system and everything else is that third. No, that's not the case. It was illegal for slaves to read. It was not legal for blacks to actually, as a collective, to start reading until after the Civil War. So, yeah.
Well, I've seen the statutes. There are laws, you are correct, and I oppose to these laws that were denying the right to read to black people. But I would say they were not getting applied because the measured rate of literacy for black slaves in the 19th century is around 20%, and it's an improvement of their condition if you compare with Africa. Of course, you add the white population that clearly had an advantage. They were at around 80. But there was definitely a part of the population that was accessing knowledge that they wouldn't have had otherwise.
That's well.
And just compare the descendants of today, for example. The descendants of the slaves of today, they definitely have access to an educational system that gets them to a much higher level of education and much higher IQ. At 85, they are the best black population, the most well-placed across the world.
Well, I think I addressed that talking point earlier as far as the descendants of slaves here opposed to the immigrants that come over here. Again, these numbers get conflated and everything else. That's why we're having this whole new movement that we're doing when we're pushing for reparations. We're being very specific on who we're talking about because, again, we have a lot of immigrants that come over to this country who's benefited a lot from what my ancestors went through. Pre-1965, it wasn't this big influx of black immigrants coming over here. So now that we got this big influx of black immigrants coming over here who's getting all these benefits and everything, all these small business loans, people like myself are not privy to, certain scholarships, foreign aid, all types of other stuff that people like myself are not privy to. So they come over here and after the civil rights movement and they're able to benefit a whole lot more than we actually are. And we're the people who actually fought for it and went through the blood, sweat, and tears. So we're the ones who actually need the most help. So I'm not concerning myself when I'm talking reparations with the immigrants that came over here. If your family doesn't descend pre-1965, I don't even want to have a reparations talk with you because your family didn't even experience Jim Crow. Your family have to go through Jim Crow as well. And that's another thing we stand away from because this isn't all about just slavery, because after slavery, we had the whole Jim Crow thing going on where we actually was trying to build up these small towns, trying to build up these communities. And every time we had our communities built up, people came around and tore it down. We got huge examples of this, like Rosewood, Black Wall Street out in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where we had these flourishing black communities that got attacked and everything else by jealous white neighbors who didn't want to see black people coming up after the Civil War, but these were southern states, and they were still upset about the decline of the economy and everything, because we all know what happened with the Civil War. The Civil War was not about freeing slaves. Let's put that out there. It was not about freeing slaves. It was about the North actually wanted to get all the wealth up to the North that the South had, because the South was the wealthy states before the Civil War. They was the ones with all the wealth. The North was actually the poor states, and they was trying to get some of that wealth up to the North. And one of the ways of doing that was crippling their main workforce, which was slaves and everything else. And it was all political move, a whole bunch of other stuff going on. We could talk about that for hours. But at the end of the day, we was promised something at the end of that war that we never got. That we was promised 40 acres and a mule and $100 a person. And we never got that. We never received that. They pushed it along so far. Then Andrew Jackson got into office, and he completely abolished anything that was in motions to happen for us to get reparations. And since 62? Since 1862, they have gave out billions of land in this billions of acres of land in this country, and not 1 inch of that land went to Black Americans that descend from slavery, not 1 inch. And it's been billions of acres since 1862. And so we're owed. This country owes us a huge debt, and I'm going to keep pressing until we get that debt paid.
All right, I think it's a good moment to talk about reparations. I will just, I think I have a different view of the North and South difference of development. The South was rich in that they had plantations. They had a basic economic activity going on. But the North, in many indicators, including the building of railroads, for example, much more common in the North. And so they had a type of development that was much more modern. And I would argue that was ultimately more wealth in the North, but it was a form of wealth that was in technological development and industrial progress. That being said, it's a point of detail. As far as reparations goes, I think it would be the worst idea possible. I disagree on two points. The first is that what is the basis for reparation? What is the status quo? What is the 0 point at which we owe you reparation? And I would argue you cannot demand reparation to descendants of white people. You cannot steal money from the people of today because they're white, because you perceive that your population was owed this in the past. You cannot punish new individuals for crimes that were committed by other individuals, even if it was their ancestor. That is my view morally. But I would say also in pragmatic terms, paying reparations to blacks in America would be a terrible idea for them. It would put them in a state where they are entitled to some income, to some amount of money, without having worked for it, with a system that is absolutely anti-meritocratic. So you would find yourself with essentially a social welfare system for blacks, which would still depress success in the black population. Because we know the key in white societies on how we reward success and how the proportion of the reward is proportional to the success and to the utility of the goods produced. So someone who starts a company that is bad will fail. Someone who starts a company that produces iPhones and that people like will have success and will have more money. If we do not have such a meritocratic approach with the black population, if we treat them as victims entitled to baseline amounts of money, we are destroying the only chance that the black society would have within the U.S. to reformulate itself on new grounds, on grounds that are meritocratic, that reward the best members of their society with more money. In the same way, we've advanced white society.
I totally disagree. I don't see how black people gaining wealth will be bad for black people. I'm a little confused by that statement, but I do want to address this whole notion that, my ancestors aren't the ones who enslaved people, or my ancestors didn't do this, or I'm not my ancestors, so why should I have to pay reparations? Well, my ancestors aren't the ones who dropped the A-bomb on Japan, right? But yet we had to help pay reparations back in the late 80s, early 90s when Japan got their reparations 40-something years later, right? My ancestors didn't commit genocide on the Native Americans, but yet my ancestors and me are still paying reparations to the Native Americans. My ancestors didn't put the Jews in the gas chambers and correctional camps. We didn't do that, but yet we are still helping pay reparations annually to Israel. So we have been helping pay for reparations forever since we've been paying taxes. So, but yet nobody cares. But when we talk about getting our reparations, everybody's like, oh, well, my ancestors didn't have nothing to do with it. My ancestors didn't do this. I didn't do anything. I had nothing to do with it. Well, when did black people do any of this stuff? We've been paying for it. So I that's like crying me crocodile tears with that one. So that's a horrible notion. Like I said, there have been groups of individuals getting paid by globally and by this country for decades for stuff that we had nothing to do with. And how come when it's time for us to get paid and it's time for us to get what's due to us in this country, what was promised to us, by the way, because slavery happened before World War II. Slavery happened before. Actually, slavery didn't happen. Slavery happened during the genocide of the Native Americans. So I can't say that. But at the end of the day, still, they got land. They got reparations. They got money. They get money. They get checked all the time just for being a registered Native American. They get a check all the time. They get tax free. They got tax free land. They get free scholarships. They get all this stuff. We don't get nothing. Then people say, well, Native Americans aren't doing that great and everything else. Well, let us not do great. Give us some land. Give us some access to some casinos. Give us a check all the time.